Hello guys, I hope wherever you're watching us from, you're having a great time. This is AfriPost and welcome to today's video. Now, have you ever found yourself in a discussion about issues affecting your community or even a group of people, but then people within your community or even within your group, you find them coming out to really oppose a stand that should really be acceptable to your group? Now, this is the case in the video that I want to play for you today. Here is a black professor who has come out to talk about modern anti-racist ideals. And he's saying that he's tired of modern anti-racism and claims that white supremacy does not exist and it is a total lie. He has highlighted certain facts that he brings around and tries to prove his point. So I don't want to really speak much, but I want us to watch this video, then come back and speak some more about it. Let's watch.
I think when we discuss racism in America and whether it exists and to what extent and how important it is, the first thing on a lot of our minds is racism from the police. And so I think we need to talk about that first. And there's some things that I don't think we always know. Tamir Rice was a black boy of about 12 who was brandishing a toy weapon, and he was shot dead. The exact same thing happened to a boy named Daniel Shaver not long after that. Daniel Shaver was white. Sam DuBose was shot dead by the police driving his car away from a cop. The exact same thing happened, actually a little bit before that, to a white guy named Andrew Thomas. Alton Sterling was a black man who reached into his waistband and reached for his wallet during an altercation with the cops, and the cops shot him dead. That was a grievous event. And the same thing actually happened around the same time to a white guy named Dylan Noble. Alton Sterling made national headlines. None of us heard about Dylan Noble. George Zimmerman said some really nasty things about unspecified little people and how they're always going around stealing things before he ended up killing Trayvon Martin. Now, that was a terrible thing, especially because a policeman said the same sorts of things, including using the word fucker, before he killed a white teenager named Lauren Simpson. I could do this for 20 minutes. There is a very understandable tendency in the media to report stories of black people unjustly killed by the police. Whereas what we don't know is that for every one of those events, there is a white teenager or 20-something who is killed under almost ominously similar conditions where you've really got to dig to find it out. Now, I'm not saying that there's fake news or some grand conspiracy. I understand why the media are so concerned with the black cases. But I'm bringing this up because I think that generally we're often told that any conversation about race is shut down by the purported racist tendencies of cops who, in a hair-trigger situation, will allow their quiet bias to kill a black guy when, if it were a white guy, he would get away with a slap on the hand. That's a very reasonable assumption. But you know, that really hasn't held up to scrutiny, and it's why I allowed myself to do this particular debate with this particular question. Even the numbers are quite different from what we hear. And so, for example, there is the issue of proportion. So, white men, 62% of the male population. They are half of the people who get killed by cops. Black men, 13%, and they are a quarter of the people who are killed by cops. And so it's disproportionate. So one might think, well, that means that still there is a racist bias against black men because so many more of them are killed proportionately. But no, not really. There's a debate team trick that's going on in relation to that. Because it wasn't so long ago that when we talked about welfare, disproportionate amount of black people were on welfare, but more white people were on welfare numerically. So if anybody pointed out that a disproportionate number of black people were on welfare, it was always pointed out by a certain crowd that no, actually many more white people are on welfare, and that was considered a smackdown comment. Well, we're in the same sort of situation. Or it was often said, if you kept asking questions, the reason there's a disproportionate number of black people on welfare is because poverty affects black people disproportionately because of structural racism. That was reasonable. Well, we also know that poverty makes it more likely for somebody to encounter a policeman in these sorts of situations. Poverty caused by structural racism, therefore, might certainly make it so that there are more black men killed by the police. And that means that we have to question the idea that what this is all about is underlying pernicious biases of the cops. I almost can't believe I'm saying this because I spent a very long time thinking what a lot of people think about the cops. I have a reputation for saying that racism is as important as people make it, but I always made an exception for the cops. And not too long ago, I had one of my blogging heads conversations with Glenn Lowry, where I told him, Glenn, you've got to give me figures if that's not true. And I didn't know that the figures actually exist. And so I had to really make an adjustment, really think in a new way about this kind of thing. What we're told about the cops simply isn't true. Therefore, when I say that anti-racism is as much a problem as a help at this point, I'm saying that after my conversion about the cops are not a smackdown issue in this debate. So, with that said, what's the issue here? Why in the world would I say that anti-racism is a problem? Because of course, no, it's not a problem to not be a racist, and I don't think any of us would be here if we thought the debate was over that. So of course you don't want to be a racist. Racism is bad, we know that. But what about the more complex and therefore more interesting issues? And one issue is that anti-racism as currently configured has gone a long way from what used to be considered intelligent and sincere civil rights activism. Today, it's a religion, and I don't mean that as a rhetorical feint. I mean that it actually is what any naive anthropologist would recognize as a faith in people, many of whom don't think of themselves as religious, but Galileo would recognize them quite easily. And so, for example, the idea that the responsible white person is supposed to attest to their white privilege and realize that it can never go away and feel eternally guilty about it, that's original sin right there. The idea that there is going to be a day when America comes to terms with race, or that there could be. What does that even mean? What is the meaning of the coming to terms? What would that consist of? Who would come to them? What would the terms be? At what date would this be? The only reason that anybody says that is because it corresponds to our conception of Judgment Day, and it's equally abstract. When we use the word problematic, especially since about 2008 or 9, what we're really saying is blasphemous. It's really the exact same term. Or the suspension of disbelief that is a characteristic of religious faith. There's an extent to which logic is considered no longer to apply. That's how we talk about racism. And so suppose someone asked, why are we to focus on the occasional rogue cop who kills a black man, when 9 times out of 10, that black man is in much more danger of being killed by another black man in his neighborhood? Gosh, that's not pretty, but like many things that aren't pretty, it's also true. If you ask about it, well, you know you're not supposed to. Eyes roll, and you're given an answer that doesn't really completely make sense, and there's an etiquette that you're supposed to stop there. It's rather like certain questions that you ask a priest very gently, but you know that if you don't get a real answer, then you're just supposed to move on. That we're used to with being devoutly religious. That is the way racism is treated these days. It's a religion. And many of us might say, you know, after thinking about it, you might realize that even if you're somebody who looks on devout religious faith among, say, a Mormon or a fundamentalist as something peculiar, you read books by anthropologists exploring this frame of mind, even if you realize, it might even be pleasant to realize about yourself that you are religious just like them. If you wonder how a Mormon feels, to be an anti-racist today is to be ideologically a very, very similar person. You might own it. You might say, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this religion? This is certainly a better religion than many others I can think of, but there are problems with it. There are severe problems with it. It does some good things. It gets some good people elected. Certainly, it does some good things, but it does some bad things. And so, for example, if you're a good anti-racist, then you're thinking about the cops that kill black men in these scenes that we know about. But you're not supposed to think about the fact that so much more murder happens to men like that in their own neighborhoods. You're supposed to think of that as maybe connected to racism in some abstract way, but you're not supposed to think about it. You're not supposed to think about all of those homicides. Every summer in big cities across America, teenage black boys are killing one another in the hundreds over frankly nothing. That's somehow less important than what the occasional rogue cop does. That's modern anti-racism for you. That's backwards. Another example, education. To be an anti-racist is to pay attention to the idea that universities must foster diversity. The idea being that supposedly universities wouldn't want to foster this diversity if they weren't made to do so. Now, what that means is that often this diversity is fostered as the result of creating a different evaluation system for black and often Latino students in terms of grades and test scores. Now, there are various studies that show that that often is not the best thing. And so Stephen Cole and Eleanor Barber did a paper where, contrary to their expectations, it showed that when students are mismatched to a university, it discourages them from getting PhDs. There have been many studies of that kind, but we're told to look away from them. So after racial preferences were banned in the University of California, before they were banned at the University of California, San Diego, in a freshman class of 3,268 students, of the freshman honors students, exactly one was black. In 1999, this is the first class admitted after the ban, when students were matched to a school according to their grades and test scores rather than there being the kind of bonus that we see. We're now seeing it at Harvard. 1 out of 5 black freshmen were making honors. Why have you never heard of that statistic? It's actually a beautiful story. These are black students who did very well, who wouldn't have done as well at Berkeley or UCLA. There's no tragedy. Those students are now out working and living wonderful lives. Anti-racism teaches us not to listen to stories like those. And when we think about anti-racism, we're taught to suppose, we start to not even think about this anymore, that whites need to undergo some sort of massive psychological revolution before we can have any kind of black success beyond what we have already. Why? Why is somebody talking about their white privilege important when we're talking about making black schools better? Why is it important for a Black Lives Matter activist to probe Hillary Clinton's heart as opposed to thinking about what policies she will take in terms of criminal sentencing or housing policy or the on-the-ground sorts of things that we really need to be thinking about if we want to help black people? I could go on here too. There are a lot of things wrong with anti-racism. There are some good things, but there are just as many that are wrong that hold us back from helping black people who need help, because we're taught to think of certain things rather than other things. In particular, we're taught to think less about the real work of helping people who need help on the ground through socio-political action, and instead we end up thinking about inner psychology, we end up thinking about that which is problematic, and all of these things are ultimately idle. So this is what I mean by saying that anti-racism is a problem. Anti-racism as currently configured, not anti-racism just in itself, but modern anti-racism, turns a blind eye to most black homicide. Anti-racism as currently configured turns a blind eye to black young people's upward mobility. It turns a blind eye to doing the kinds of things that civil rights leaders of 50 years ago considered ordinary, in favor of what is ultimately an inwardly focused quest for moral absolution that has at best a diagonal relationship to helping people who've been left behind. For that reason, the issue here, I must repeat, is not whether or not racism exists. We know it does. Read the paper this morning, had some racism of my own 2 weeks ago. That's not the issue. The issue is whether modern anti-racism is the best way of combating the effects of that racism. And it isn't.
Now, did you really take a good listen to that professor? Because for me, he sounds like he's coming from planet Mars. He does not know what blacks have gone through over the years. He does not know the kind of challenges that blacks have endured. He hasn't understood the kind of laws that were created to restrain blacks from ever growing or even being better than they are. I'm perplexed at the examples that he's trying to give here, because he's saying that things that happen to blacks also happen to whites, and therefore the argument that people are pushing around should not be that which tries to alienate whites out of blacks. But I would have been happier if he came with empirical evidence that gives quantitative value to the discussion that he's having, because he cites one case of a black person being murdered by a cop, then cites another case of a white person being murdered by a cop. And therefore he says that all these two are equal, and therefore we should not be looking at blacks' cases as though they are so much important than other cases. But for me, this is totally wrong. The professor fails to acknowledge the existence of systemic racism within Americans' system. But for me, with the little research that I've done, systemic racism remains entrenched in many institutions within America. I want to put it to you this way. Remember that the founders of America as it is were white. And when they were white, they were also slave owners. So, when they created the first laws that they were using to govern the country that they created, the laws were automatically going to favor them over the slaves that they had. And these slaves were black. So what would be the outcome of this kind of a country? Automatically, those who are white will remain privileged, and those who are black will remain disenfranchised. And this is the case that has led to United States as it is today. We know that there has been a lot of fights from civil rights movement and many other agitations that have desired for American system to grow. But then total freedom has never been realized. We have seen even the United States President Barack Obama rising to power as a black person. But was he truly the son of slaves within America? He was not. He was like an immigrant, because his parent, who is black, was Kenyan, where I come from. And he was not a slave. He went there as a student who was studying. So you find that the reality is that most blacks whose ancestors were slaves, though what they have gone through has never really been represented at the top level of political space within America. So this is a very, very serious issue for me. I asked myself a lot of questions when I was listening to this lecture by this professor, because has he ever seen news of a white person calling the cop to a small child who is black? Have they not seen the kind of discrimination that some black people find themselves undergoing in different institutions within America? We'll not talk about the trigger-happy police forces that has been used over time to really suppress blacks. But then, has he not really internalized what has been going on within American society? So I think in this case, the professor is totally out of order. He does not really understand what is going on, and he does not have a lot of facts when he's speaking. He has not brought any evidence to prove the percentages of these kind of activities or scenarios that is kind of highlighting. He has not given us any data to prove what he's claiming. So for me, I beg to differ with him. Blacks have gone through a lot, and there is no media bias against what is going on. If there's been any bias in the media, it has been that which supports white supremacy, because all institutions have been used as social engineering tools to give us a conditioning in our mind to think that some people are superior to others and that blacks are inferior. So I think the guy is totally out of order. He doesn't understand his craft, and he needs a good response. So this is part of a two-part series that I'll be giving you. This is the first part. Tomorrow I'll be posting to you a response from also another professor. Though this professor is white, he has given a bit-by-bit blow on every issue that this black professor has touched. I want you to watch this and keep it here for tomorrow's episode, where we'll be giving you the response from this white professor. So if you're watching us for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and also share. Also remember to give us your opinion down in the comment section so that we may also understand your perspective about the issue. Thank you, and may the good Lord bless you. Goodbye.